Hi everyone, my name is Natalie. Today I wanted to discuss short stories as a form of writing and as a form of reading experience as well. What spurred this video on basically was that I read Mouthful of Birds by Samantha Schweblin, which is a book that came out in February this year, and it's by the fantastic writer of Fever Dream that I loved last year. And I read Mouthful of Birds I think in March this year, and I actually really liked the short story collection, and I know a lot of people didn't like it, but that got me thinking about what I look for in a short story and how my expectations for short stories are very specific to the form in comparison to, for example, what I expect from a novel. So I wanted to do a little bit of a discussion video talking about short story as a form of writing, and to also, I would really love to hear your thoughts about the medium or this form of writing. So first of all, what I look for in a short story is an idea, a really interesting thought and theme or topic or idea that is explored in a way that makes sense within the story structure. That means that it doesn't have to be an entire world. You don't have to tell me everything about the world in order for me to be able to enjoy the short story. For me, it is enough that the story that takes place in the pages makes sense within those pages. Obviously, it's very subjective when it comes to what is enough information and what isn't. But I think the major difference for me when it comes to novels and short stories is that with a novel, you are allowed to have weak points in the story, in the plot narrative, and the plot line, and the development of characters, in the sort of the pacing of the story. You're allowed to have those gaps. There's enough time to make up for it. But in a short story, you really need to be very careful with your words, and I think that also shapes how I read short stories. Usually I read them fairly slowly. I usually take my time with both reading the actual story but also reading an entire collection. It's very rare that I just read them in one go, and that is another thing I was wondering about, whether people usually read short story collections as a book, like just read them from cover to cover, or if you read them more like dipping in and out of them. I think in the past I have done both, and I think my favorite way of reading short story collections at the moment is to have something in between. To read them like over a week or something, to read a few in one go or one every day, so that it's close enough that I can see overarching themes and structures over the a full collection, see reappearing patterns, or even reappearing characters, and that's another thing I wanted to talk about. But if you read them too close together, they can often melt into one another. And I think that is what I've heard about a lot of, especially Mouthful of Birds, how none of the stories really stand up on its own. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it's such a short, the stories are so short. You don't get to spend a lot of time with each story before you move on to the next, and especially if you're the kind of person who read them as a book, as just one chapter after the other, then I think it's a very good chance that they will just sort of become this mush of a thing, and they won't have time to really build those images in your mind. Like, for example, with G.D. Salinger's 9 stories, one of the things that I love that he does in those are to capture a single moment in the middle of a character's life. You can feel that they have lived before the story starts and continues to live off the page when it ends. And I don't think that is always the case. It doesn't always feel like characters in literature move and live outside of the books. At least that is not the case for me. But I feel like J.D. Salinger, one of the things that he does well is just to throw you into the middle of someone's life story. And it feels intimate in that sense, but also that you see a moment that isn't necessarily going to stick with the character themselves. It really captures the way that time is so fleeting. So there are two mainly short story writers that I've read that are classics that really introduced me to the genre, and one of them is J.D. Salinger's 9 Stories. The other one that I was introduced actually even before J.D. Salinger, I think, is The Lottery and Other Stories by Shirley Jackson. I love her as a writer, but the first thing I read was The Lottery and Other Stories. And I didn't actually love it when I was reading it. I did love The Lottery itself, that story. The reason that I was intrigued by Shirley Jackson after having read the collection is actually that it just continued to linger with me. I was constantly thinking about the short story collection, and I couldn't figure out why. I couldn't really pinpoint what it was in the collection that I kept thinking about, but it did have that effect. And I think both Jackson's short stories and J.D. Salinger's sort of set me up for what I wanted in short stories after that. And it's a bit hard to explain really, but I think in the easiest way for me to describe it is just a complete removal of excess wordings, and to either get an idea or an emotion, some kind of theme or topic dealt with in the collection, and it needs to be realized in a way that feels true to the world that it is. And I mean, that is a very vague way of talking about the form and my expectations. But I think when I've read short stories that I don't like, it's usually because there's no explanations for what happens in the story within the story itself. It doesn't make sense in its own frame. And I mean, I feel like it's probably mostly a feeling I have rather than something that I can really pinpoint. Maybe I should just go with a red pen and sort of deconstruct what I love in short stories. Another thing that I've been thinking about in relation to short stories is the idea of interconnected short stories as almost bridging on a novel, and the difference between a short story collection and a novel told in interconnected stories. One of the things that I've always assumed is that a collection of stories that have reoccurring characters I've always thought of as a novel. But that isn't really the case with Salinger. He does have reoccurring characters in all of his writings. But I would be interested to hear what you think is required for a collection of stories to be called a novel rather than a short story collection. I'm not sure how I feel about them, these boundaries. But definitely I've always thought of stories that have reoccurring characters as a novel, and Salinger just does the opposite of that. Some of my favorite short stories though are not realist like the classic Salinger and Jackson, but rather magical realism. And some of them that I've really loved is The Lonesome Bodybuilder by Yukiko Motoya, which I read last year, and it's a collection of some magical, some really weird and out there stories. One of them is about women walking their men in like dog collars. One is about a woman who wants to become a bodybuilder, as is the title of the collection. But the first half of the collection is mostly magical and whimsy stories, and the further we get into the collection, the darker the themes are. The other one that I wanted to mention is The Doll's Alphabet by Kromila Gordova, which is a collection that I was reminded by sometimes when I read The Lonesome Bodybuilder. And this one is also magical in terms of magical realism. It definitely plays on what is possible and the boundaries of the world. but this is much weirder in tone, in content, in ingredients. Both these collections definitely have feminist themes in them. So the first collection in the Doll's Alphabet is about women sort of changing themselves and becoming liberated, but they do so by unstitching themselves, I think is how it's put in the story. And there's reoccurring sort of themes about women getting power, not necessarily getting power over men, although that is sometimes the case, but mostly just getting power over themselves and to take agency. And I think that is probably in part what drew me to both of the collections. Sometimes they're so out there, and sometimes they take on themes and ideas, just concepts really, that is something that might be so strange that it could never work in a longer form like a novel. I think that is why magical realism short stories are quite popular, especially I get the sense through BookTube that they are quite popular here, exploring ideas and visions or images that could never be sustained realistically in a longer form. And the short story is the place that they can be allowed to exist in a still believable way, as I said, within their own frame. I think even if you have a really out there idea and you look at it closely enough and really paint the picture of all of the, like a micro kind of perspective on it, it can still feel realistic somehow. That there's enough detail, enough information for you to believe it. That was mainly what I wanted to say, that I wanted to just discuss my own experiences of short stories so far. I definitely have not read a ton of short stories because I was I was introduced to the form fairly recently, but these are my thoughts at the moment, and I would love to know how you feel about short stories. Do you like them? Do you read them a lot? How do you read them? As I said, do you read them in one go or sort of spread them out? And what kinds do you like? All of those things, I would love to hear about them in the comments. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I will talk to you soon. Bye!